Hey,
everybody. Welcome. It's 8:15 in the morning, and it's Tuesday, and this is as good as you're going to feel for the entire week. So savor this moment together because it's really only going to get more intense. I'm Ian, and we'll do intros. Welcome to Intro to Identity. First off, I'm thrilled this is a full room. Second of all, I'm thrilled not only this is a full room, but there are people that, colleagues and people that we know industry in this room. And why that's important is because they may know a couple things. And so those of you who are new to this space, you get to interact with them. Let's talk about what we're going to do. Identity is kind of a big thing, like topic-wise. It takes an entire week just to get to WAS. So we're going to dehydrate that. We're going to like deplete uranium this thing and try to get you through the entirety of identity in 2 15-minute sessions. They said it cannot be done, and they are right. So here's how to think about this. We're going to just kind of fly over the continent of identity. And we're going to talk about things that we think you need to know in sort of a 101, 201 kind of context. What we want to do, and what Hutch is going to spend a lot of time at the end doing, is trying to put this in context. Because there's a whole lot of piece parts in this industry. Like there's a whole lot of bits, and sometimes it's really hard to figure out how the heck do all these things fit together. But if you hit a topic and you're like, ooh, I want to learn more about that, 2 things. This is, shockingly, audience participation, so feel free to ask questions. And second of all, go find sessions this week. The reason why this is at 8:15 on Tuesday morning is because it gives you time to find other sessions about the things that are interesting to you or relevant to you. We're going to try to cover 4 major things. We're going to start by talking about the constituencies, the kinds of people that we as identity professionals actually serve. Like, we're doing all this work, who's getting the benefit? Right? So we'll talk about that first. We try to figure out a way to split the identity world into reasonably sized pieces. There is a little bit debate amongst even the 3 of us on this, but the way we did it was we'll talk about what we're calling admin time technologies, essentially things that you do to administrate identities. I'll do that part. Pam is going to do the, okay, so great, we set everything up. What happens when we drop the ball at the top of the track and it goes like all down the thing and hits the domino and then hits the mouse and that hits, like the candle? Like, how does that all work? The runtime aspects. And then Hutch has got the inglorious job of figuring out how to put all the crap we said together that actually could make sense of it all, right? Essentially provide you that context for all of this. What we are not going to do, we're not going to define what identity is, because like that's a whole conference unto itself. Trust me on this one, just go with it. Just pretend like you know what that word means, because that's all we do. We're not going to define every single term. Here's the thing, especially for those of you new to identity management, little trick. Get 3 identity professionals in a room. Ask them about something. Let's say fine-grained access control. Oh, yeah. You will get 6 definitions from 3 people. It's just a peculiarity of the industry. It just happens that way. Don't worry about it. Like, you will get more from the contextual use of these terms than we will get from doing a definitional thing. So with that, it's time for these 3 stooges to cram knowledge into your head. I hope you're caffeinated. First, who the heck is talking to you? So we're going to introduce each other. So I have the honor of introducing Pam Dingle. Woo, Pam! Among Pam's skills, we didn't rehearse this part.
We didn't. We're just making it up now.
Yeah, we're totally making it up now. So Pam is currently at Microsoft overlooking standards work and trying to, her secret skill is making really technically complex things humanized. Like actually express to you like why this technical thing matters. Like that's Pam's secret skill. She's also the co-founder in Women in ID. She's done a ton of stuff. She puts up with an Australian at home. For those of you who do that, congratulations. And she has an unhealthy obsession with my dog.
Yes, all dogs actually.
Yeah, it's true. Okay.
She is also ostensibly the nicest person at this entire
Yes, and she is actually the most optimistic person you will meet at this entire conference. Okay, who's introducing me?
Then I guess I'm introducing Ian.
I'll hold on this.
Yeah, I'll let you.
Retain power.
I don't even know if I need to introduce Ian. Ian is
If you've been to
practice,
fraud, yes.
if you've been to any identity conference, Ian's probably, if he's not one of the keynote speakers, he's certainly a prominent speaker in the thing. He's certainly one of the people I remember from when I started out in the industry acting as a mentor. So he's the VP at Salesforce for identity product management.
Stuff.
He is the founder and president of IDPro, which is you will hear a lot more about. He started it up with the Burton Group in Gartner, contributed to SPML and SCIM.
Sorry about the SPML thing. That's, for those of you who know standards, that wasn't the highest achievement in our industry, but we survived.
He's dedicated to killing identity and access management in order to save it. Nishan's got the t-shirt on. I should have worn that
Really
t-shirt
wearing
if
it.
I knew I was going to be introducing you. Loves commas, which I didn't even know what that was.
Oh, it's just that CSV files are like the cure for everything, right? So as an identity professional, one of the things you have to learn is like comma-separated value files. They're the cause of and cure for pretty much everything. So
If you're following the Identiverse hashtag, you know that Ian also
see my socks?
has an obsession with his socks.
Yeah,
Yes.
there you go.
And he does. He actually, we decided to locate Identiverse in DC because Ian was here.
That's not true. All right,
All right.
introduce Hutch.
All right. So Hutch is an incredibly talented architect. He is also a history buff. You ask him anything about the history of maybe anything, and he will tell you how things went down, in what order, and with an amazing amount of detail.
Challenge accepted.
Challenge accepted. Which is amazingly useful for identity because, you know, what I think you're going to see in the next couple of hours is that identity is shared experience, right? So anytime anything happens, you can just turn in this way. So Hutch works for GE and has many stories to tell about how that works. And when I first met Hutch, I met Hutch when I was working for Ping Identity back in the day, and he has this incredibly amazing talent to deliver really bad news in the nicest tone of voice known to man. It's absolutely amazing. So you have to, I think the one thing you need to know about Hutch is that you need to listen to every word, because sometimes it's not obvious what wisdom is coming through, and then all of a sudden it will hit you an hour later, what all of the implications are. So that's my advice for you.
Wow.
All right, let's do this.
Okay.
Okay, so you two can take a seat while I
we're
run
out
this
here.
table. All right, so before we dive into it, if you consider yourself sort of new-ish to identity management, raise your hand.
Yeah, I want to see this.
That's awesome. Okay, we're gonna do this really fast. I need you to look to your left, look to your right. If you don't know one of those people, shake their hand, introduce yourself. Take 2 minutes. Go.
Hi, I'm Sue Bones from
I'm
Microsoft.
Hutch.
Good point.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Steve Hutchinson. I kind of remember you.
All right. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to do this was because you're not in this thing alone. As an identity practitioner, sometimes you feel like there's not really someone out there to help you, because oftentimes you have a very small team, you're asked to do a whole lot of stuff, and it's tough sometimes to find a little help. So the people that you've just talked to, you will see them the rest of the week. They're your support network for this and going forward. So keep in mind that identity isn't just about all of the technology, it's about the profession itself and us as practitioners. So with that, wait, Pam, are you staying up or?
No, I just wanted to see everybody talking
Oh,
to
okay,
each
I
other.
see.
That was all.
You want to stay up? Okay, bye. All right, so let's talk about who we serve. It's so easy to lose the forest for the trees in identity management. There are so many little bits, there are so many little nuances and abbreviations and random factoids. What we're going to try to do is keep this more contextualized, right? And a good way to do that is to think about who is it that ultimately is going to benefit from the work that I'm working on. And whether that is an employee, whether that's a business partner or a citizen or a student, in everything you do as an identity professional, you should keep that individual in your mind, right? Because if we do that, then we can maybe get a little bit more context. We get a little bit wider view to realize like, hey, the reason why I'm doing this automated provisioning project is because we're about to hire 5,000 new people, and we've got to make them productive day one. Right? So it's that kind of mentality of keeping the individual in your mind is going to really help you. Okay, so there are a variety of different kinds of constituencies that we tend to serve as identity professionals. And it doesn't mean that we always use the same stuff to help them. So on one end, we have, I would say, a more traditional world in identity management, which tends to be employees and contractors. You tend to find a lot more things like user provisioning, a lot more admin time type tools. And then on the other side, you have customers, you have citizens, you have all of the people that are not inside your organization. And that takes more of a modern approach to deliver the services that they need. And we'll talk more about all this in a sec. So employees, your mission is the right access to the right people, the right place, the right time. Like, that's what we're trying to do, is like get the stuff to the people so they can be productive. And that's true for your contractors. Often it does have a lot of resonance with your business partners. But here's the thing. If I'm talking to consumers, it's a little bit different. Like, the mission of the business is, I want to deliver an awesome experience, right? No one is in the business of actually like just giving people accounts and calling it a day in a B2C setting. It's like, great, you can log in, I'm done here. No, that's just the beginning of the relationship, right? So it's about that experience that you're delivering, and we as identity professionals are helping to deliver that experience. We're a critical on-ramp for it. So B2E, employees, it's about productivity, right? Want them to be productive when they arrive. Make sure that access doesn't stick around after they leave, both kind of important. More often than not, human resources and your HR system is the, nap time, is the source of truth. People that have been in the identity industry a little bit, how many times have you had really good data from HR? Show of hands. Okay, so here's the thing. I've talked to organizations back in the day which have had multiple HR systems. That's entertaining. Data quality is mediocre, let's say, but often that is our source of truth, because if someone shows up in HR, they're gonna get paid, ostensibly, and so we gotta make them productive, ostensibly, so like that's a good source of truth. And if there's one quote to think about employee identity, it's who has access to what, right? It's sort of making sure that the right people have access to the right stuff. And we'll talk a little bit about life cycles. So the life cycle that really is the governing one here is known as joiner, mover, leaver. People join the organization, they move around, they change roles in the organization, and they leave the organization eventually. This all should be powered by HR as a source of truth, hopefully. Next constituency, our business partners. So we need to connect to our business partners. It does not matter what industry you are in, you've got to connect to your partners. And so this is really about making sure that members of your supply chain can interact with you. You're giving them the apps, hopefully they're showing up with the identity bits, right? So here it's your partner's system of record, it's like their HR system, and you're at least 1 degree removed from it. So what do you have? Well, oftentimes you have delegated administration to do the lifecycle management. Essentially, there is a person that you go to like, oh, okay, GE's my business partner, IW delegated administrator, and now Hutch is gonna manage users for GE in my app. That's the kind of the spirit behind delegated administration. Last but not least, B2C, so consumers. This is about just bringing whatever the awesome is that your organization does to the people. Now the problem is, if you talk to many people in business who are building that service, they're like, and then the person's gonna do this, and the person's gonna do this, and like there's always that identity professional in the back like, excuse me, I have a question. How'd that person get there? They're like, well, yeah, they logged in. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about that. And suddenly you realize that most people that are building those services have no idea what we do at all. And so this is a real amazing opportunity actually to like make the awesome, whatever your organization does, get that to the people, like that is your mission. But in this world, the life cycles are different. It's about the individual, it's about the citizen, it's about the consumer. And they're in control of that life cycle, not you, right? So you've got to be able to accommodate that. Here's the other thing. Just as we're not alone in this room together in terms of practitioners who've been doing this for some time and practitioners that are new, we're also not alone in our enterprises, right? We can't get our jobs done without our peers in security and our peers in privacy. There are 3 legs in this stool to make it work. Identity provides essentially the operational controls for privacy in terms of governance to data. And we provide really valuable context to security, so we put the who in the who the heck is on my network kind of type questions. So we're really tightly related to all of our peers here. And so if you're working in a B2B especially or B2C setting, and you haven't met your peers in the privacy team or the security team, go seek them out, right? They have valuable tools that you can help enrich and can help you as well. Okay, so now, with a little bit of like, who are we serving, let's talk about some of the technologies. Let's talk about some of the approaches. So, like I said in the beginning, there's a ton of technology and terms. We picked a way to split up the world into this administrative and runtime settings. So essentially, the technologies and disciplines used to set things up, admin time, or the things that are actually being used when the user is logging in or going through a forgot password process. That's the runtime side. So I'm going to do admin time. Anywhere along the line, have a question, just shout it out. We'll try to field it. All right, I need more coffee. This will be good. Okay, so things we want to cover when we talk about admin time. Sources of truth. Remember at the beginning we said we weren't going to define terms? I'm not going to define the word truth because we'll be here for like weeks. We'll talk about where we store user records, so repositories and directories. We'll talk about the discipline of identity governance and administration, which is really about lifecycle management and access control from an admin perspective. We'll talk about analytics. And then there's 2 others that are admin time, but they don't always sort of fit in the same bucket. If you were to go to let's say, Gartner analyst and ask them about this, these last 2, they're like, well, no, that's a different Magic Quadrant. Like, their parallelograms are weird. But privilege account management and proofing. Okay, so sources of truth. Like, how do I know who someone is? This is a deep question, but it's only Tuesday, and none of us have had enough coffee for that question. So we're going to think about it more like this. How can I find reasonably good authoritative records about people? Like, I need to send their paycheck somewhere. Or I need the shipping address of my business partner. Like, how do I find this data? So for employees, tends to be HR. For partners, tends to be that delegated admin or essentially one step removed from their HR system. And in consumer settings, it's the individual. Like, they are the authoritative source for much of the information you will use. But sometimes it's going to be their institution of higher learning or their local government. You're probably going to have multiple of these things in your environment. You're going to need to in a lot of cases. And data quality is kind of a thing. And what you will find is we are so dependent on data for doing things like ensuring people have the right access. Our ties to these sources of truth are really strong. The problem is we can't always rely on the data. Sometimes it's a little bit messy. Okay, so we have a source of truth. That's good. Now we're going to create a user record. Right? Where are we going to store that user record? Well, could be in good old relational database. It could be in an LDAP directory, which is sort of historically one of the places this was served, something like Active Directory, or literally insert every vendor under the Sun's name here directory, like the Sun Java 1 Enterprise Edition directory. Like, the names just got really silly. But you may just have a web service that just says like, hey, who is this person? And they can give you back some records. Often, this system of record, or this user repository, is synchronized in some way with a source of truth. So I may have an automated feed that takes people from Workday as they are added and bring them into my directory or my user repository. Or in a consumer setting, it may be, oh, someone used social registration, and that's how they end up in the system in the directory. The tricky part is sometimes your enterprise will say, well, we really don't trust the HR system for historical reasons, possibly. So we're going to treat one of these directories, like let's say Active Directory, we'll say that's our source of truth, and we're just going to start from there. That's okay too. You just have to know what bit you're working with. Okay, so we have a source of truth. Now we have some place to store users. What does that look like? Well, classically in a relational database, it's like I'm storing first name and email and things like that. And that's pretty familiar for anyone who's worked with a relational database. Or in LDAP, things look all weird and strange because it's a tree, and like data looks a little bit different. At the end of the day, say mission is achieved, right? I'm storing attributes, I'm storing facts about people, like here's their first name, and maybe where they work and their job code, or in a consumer setting, it's like, here's their shipping address, right? Doesn't really matter what the back end is. And so this is something that certainly I'd like to stress, which is, in some regards, I really don't care about the what happens kind of behind the veil. Like how the service gets delivered doesn't matter. Whether you're using a relational database or an LDAP directory, really doesn't matter at the end of the day. It's more about the service that you deliver based on that.
Unless you're the directory administrator.
Well, sure, as Pam said, unless you're the directory administrator, then it really matters what one you're using. Okay. So next big topic, identity governance and administration. These are the tools to manage who has access to what. They are traditionally more employee and contractor focused. They are often strongly tied to your HR system. So we see them on the more traditional enterprise-centric line of the spectrum. This is where I got my start in identity. I got started in this, user provisioning. So this is a system that helps create and maintain and eventually remove user accounts in other systems. So you turn it on, and you point it at, say, your you've got a Linux farm over here, you got a bunch of connectors for that. You've got a connector to Workday to listen for changes. So the provisioning system can take action based on something that the source of truth says. Like, oh, okay, good. I just saw that my man Matt was added, and I'm going to get that feed from HR, and it's going to flow into the provisioning system. And then there's basically rules that say, okay, now that we have this new hire, and we know what his job code is, and we know what location they're in, I'm going to start going and setting up access. So we're going to do things like assign entitlements. Now, this can be something that requires approvals. So for basic stuff, like day one access, we may not need approvals, right? Because everybody's going to get access to the productivity suite. Everybody's going to get email. This is not very controversial. There is air conditioning right here. Sweet. Not controversial. I don't need an approval. But if you want to get access to the mainframe and as a sysadmin, yeah, that's going to take some approvals, right? So mix and match. Provisioning systems require connectivity. This seems pretty obvious. Like, oh yeah, I guess if I'm going to create an account in this system over here, I have to be able to talk to it. This should be easier than it is. This is a colossal pain in the butt. One of the things I did was I worked for a company called Access 360. We got bought by IBM. We became Tivoli Identity Manager. I'm sorry. And so my job was to look after, from a product management perspective, all the connectors. So if you've ever had like a tweaky thing where, say, PeopleSoft releases a 5th-digit patch release, and then your provisioning connector breaks because they changed the API, yeah, that's the problem with connectors. It's really hard. So one of the things that we as an industry have tried to do is say, this is ridiculous. Like every single app has its own way of creating users. What a pain. Why? Because many of them were never built to be remotely administrated. They're like, nope, this is my world. Like, no, I'm just going to be like my own little world. So what we did in the industry was we've tried a couple of times to standardize the interfaces to make connectors easier, right? Because it really sucks to have to build a connector for each little flavor of an app, let alone your homegrown apps. So we kidded about it. We joked about it a little bit before, which is there was a thing called Service Provisioning Markup Language, or SPUML. Best of intentions didn't work. So now the better one is SCIM, System for Cross-Identity Management. And it is a standard. So it's essentially, it's a set of rules that describe how you can create, update, manage users, and how you get a listing of those users, right? Because very rarely do you ever come across a system in your enterprise that doesn't have users already in it. So you've got to connect to it, find out what's in there, and then rationalize that against like, it's kind of weird that Hutch has the ability to, I don't know, create a locomotive. Maybe like we should deprovision him from having the ability to create locomotives. Could you? Well, you can still create engines. It's pretty cool. One big thing, this is a key mistake I often saw people making, was they try to automate everything. Don't do that, right? You've got hundreds, if not thousands, of systems and services in your enterprise. Trying to automate provisioning to all that is just diminishing returns. So the thing you should be looking at are the systems that have the largest user populations or the most churn in those systems, essentially either high volume or high velocity systems where automation's really powerful. It's either too many requests for your help desk team or whomever to manage, or it is so sensitive that you really want to lock down the rules of who gets access to it, and that makes sense to automate. I would say for the vast number of systems, you're going to do non-automated, which means either people will ask for access, or you will manually create the account because you don't do it very often. And in some cases, that system that you want to create an account in lives somewhere the hell else. And so the only way you can get to it is you open up a ticket in some cases. That's okay. You don't have to automate all of this stuff. Things like day one access are really good to automate because, again, it's non-controversial to some extent. You get email, you get productivity, you get inside the employee portal, maybe you get VPN, maybe not. And then lastly, often these systems were involved in setting up passwords. So often you would find that these provisioning systems would also have aggregate password content rules. And this exposed all sorts of shenanigans because how many people have, and I'm not picking on them just because, how many people have an Oracle database in their infrastructure? Oracle users, couple? Yeah, business has changed. Well, so for a long time, Oracle had this really tiny special character set, like 5 special characters. Now, full disclosure, day job, Salesforce, we had 8. We've expanded it to 20, but like we had a really small thing. But if you had a password rule that said it has to be this long and this many special characters, and someone puts in a special character that Oracle couldn't accept, but Active Directory could, everything would blow up. So like there's these weird things about dealing with password management when it comes to systems. Also, fun fact, sorry, while I'm on it, you can have a full password. Your password for Salesforce can be all emojis. I had a bonus tied to this and nothing. All right. Okay, so if we have a source of truth and users flow into a repository, and that triggers our user provisioning system to start creating users, it's not just enough to create the user account. We also have to know like what can that account do. And so this is what we call entitlement management. Essentially, like here are the things you're allowed to do in systems. And this can get really detailed really fast because if you think about all the little privileges that you may have in a system, too many to count. It's like grains of sand on a beach. So we try to aggregate these things together. So it kind of looks like this problem where I just have a couple of employees and I have only one system and there's 4 privileges. Well, Hutch needs all those privileges to create a purchase order and Pam needs all those privileges to create this. This gets unmanageable super fast. So as people that are, from time to time think they're computer scientists, how do we solve this problem? Layers of abstraction. So we put this thing in between. We call it an entitlement. We say this allows you to manage purchase orders. And it's these things that the provisioning system hands out, right? So not the yellow things on the right because there's way too many of them. We'll abstract that and say, here is an ability, or here is something associated with your job responsibility. So entitlement management means cataloging the stuff you have. This can be a massive undertaking. So at a just medium-sized bank, call it 10 major systems, which is really very low. You may have thousands upon thousands of privileges, which you aggregate into maybe 1,000 or so entitlements that you then need to figure out how to map to people that need stuff. Entitlement management is this cataloging process. Ideally, you are bundling these things together into things that make some semblance of sense, which is to say, look, I want to gather all the entitlements together that someone who works in purchasing would need. Or I want to make sure that I've put together the entitlements that someone who's a business partner who's at the gold tier but not the silver tier have access to. So we're working towards making this manageable. this tends to be necessary work if you're ever going to do segregation of duty analysis. So for those of you who deal with like Sarbanes-Oxley, when that was a thing, it's a little less of a thing now because we have GDPR, so that's good. Where you have to figure out like, I want to make sure that people can't do two things that in combination are dangerous. And so that's segregation of duty, and you need to do this kind of stuff. All right, so I've got now my entitlements, like manageable things. Here's the thing, even that is a little cumbersome, right? Even that is really challenging. So what we try to do in many organizations, not all, something called role management. You may have heard it as role-based access control. Essentially, it's like this. In some organizations, job functions are very regular. So if you think about a retail bank, you have people that work as tellers. Now, it doesn't matter what branch they're in, tellers all do the same thing. And then you have different kinds of those things. Now, to be clear, not every organization works like this. In hierarchical organizations, so retail is a good example of that, this works really well. You know where it works really crappy? Is matrixed organizations. Because it's really hard to say, like, if I asked any one of you to be like, name me your 3 top job responsibilities, you're gonna say, you mean today or tomorrow? Because that's always shifting, right? So role management can be useful to say, these kinds of job responsibilities need this kind of access, and we'll call that thing a role. And sometimes you have this thing called a technical role. Essentially, like, here's the low-level bits that you're gonna need to do your job, and it's just a handy bundle to assign people. You need to review the content of these roles on an ongoing basis. So you create a role that says purchasing manager. You put a bunch of entitlements in there. And over time, what you've done in SAP and maybe what you've done in some of your other systems starts to shift a little bit. And now the purchasing manager role has a little bit more access than you thought. All of a sudden it's like, oh, not only can I manage POs, oops, we accidentally inserted the ability to create a PO. Well, that's a toxic combination. That's something that you shouldn't be able to do together. So you need to review these things on an ongoing basis. Role-based access control. So not more than about 25 miles north of here is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's NIST, the home of role-based access control. So if at the end of the week you want to drive up there and throw eggs, don't do that. It's a federal property, and you'll get arrested. But there's a really good beer bar across the street, and you can sit there and wait for NIST employees to come in and be like, seriously? Like, my boss says I have to do this. I don't even know what it is. Role-based access control is just a way to govern who gets access to what through the use of roles. We don't need to overthink it. It works great in regular hierarchical homogeneous organizations. Not surprising, things like departments of defense. Really works well at. Doesn't work great at like your scrappy 150 person startup. Like, it ain't gonna work. And don't try to do that. You can have what we call a role explosion, where you have more roles than people. Yeah, see, some of the salty veterans are like, oh, I survived that. They told me that was a good idea. It was a horrible idea. Company I worked with when I was an analyst, that was a badge of honor for them. They were bound and determined to do role-based access control. And the way they did that was they just did like a high-speed merge of a heavily matrixed organization into SAP. Yeah, it was a good time. So great, now people have access. Day 1, they're productive. Day 2, they're productive. Day 3, they start to become a privileged threat because they've got too much access. Like the best way to get more and more capabilities in an enterprise is just change jobs, right? So you go from doing this job to another job, and more often than not, my observation is you don't lose your old access. You keep the old stuff. Like the easiest way to like get more IT bits is just change jobs. Like, oh, here's another laptop, or here's a monitor, and the next thing you know, you've got way more access than you should. And the other thing that tends to happen is you onboard someone new, and they're like, okay, well, the dreaded, whose access should we model you after? Okay, so anyone who's gone through any form of IT security audit knows that this is like kind of a horrifying thing. Like, oh yeah, well, I'm gonna model my access off of, who would you say? Who would, common answer, who would you say? Your peer. Peer, hold on, who else? Anyone else? Your boss. Your boss is like the biggest source of access violations in the world because that person has accreted access over years. And like, they're a horrible person to emulate. See, my boss is not here right now. He comes tomorrow, so I can totally say this. So certification is the ongoing review of who's got stuff. Now, often the auditors say, I want to see you doing this quarterly. That became very tedious. Better is to say, if someone deviates from a norm, so we have a set of peers, like you all roughly look like you have the same access, and if you're really an outlier, that's what I want to go certify. I want to go figure out why that is. So there's a variety of techniques with access certification, but it's a very powerful way to make sure you don't have issues with the access and entitlements that you've assigned in a non-automated fashion. So there's a lot of data flowing around here, right? If it's not suddenly obvious, you're like, I have all my users, times all the systems, times all the entitlements, times all the roles, times all the privileges. Oh my gosh, whole lot of stuff. How do we make sense of it? One of the ways we do this is through a little bit of analytics and intelligence, which is to look at entitlement data, look at the assignment of that, and it's a foot pedal now, by the way, people. It's all good. And try to figure out, what does risk look like? What does a normal user look like? Like, who is that person? And then what does a heavily privileged user look like? Like, who is someone who probably modeled like a system administrator or a developer is going to have really different looking access than someone that's working in finance or working in the field sales organization. And so trying to find commonality of that and understand, what does access-related risk look like in the organization? That's what IAI tries to do. What's cool about this is you can hook this up, and Pam will talk about this and Hutch will talk about this, you can hook this up to your runtime systems. Because maybe if the person is not particularly risky, then I don't need to challenge them for other things during the login process. But if that person has a lot of privilege and a lot of power in my systems, maybe they deviate from the norm in their job role, maybe I'm going to do some different things. So gleaning some intelligence by what's out there through our entitlement analysis and our role analysis. Two other things, and then I'm going to hand off. Privileged account management. There are special accounts out there. Your sysadmin accounts, your root accounts. These things aren't people, right? But they're super privileged user accounts. So we may in fact have a team of people that have to act like the root administrator. So privileged account management is a way of getting those special accounts under control. You can essentially check them out, like, hey, I need to go in and apply a 0-day patch, and so I need to act like the root administrator, and the system will essentially give me that access after validating who I am. It may record the screen so that as I'm doing actions, we have a log of what's going on. Think about it this way. I've got a third-party service vendor who's going to come in and do maintenance on a specialized piece of equipment. And I would like to have an audit log of the actions that they took. So this is like the record function, if you will, in privileged account management. And then what it does is it makes sure that the passwords are all scrambled, so no one actually retains that password to the root or sysadmin. Really, really powerful. Lance Peterman, sometime this week, find Lance. He works at Merck. He oversees their privileged account management. He does a session on sort of things he's learned through going through some pretty amazing cyber attacks and what privilege management can and can't do. So go hunt down Lance if you've got any questions about this. Last but not least in the admin section. Oh, by the way, there's going to be a break in 10 minutes. Trust me, you're getting out of here alive. Proofing. OK, so Pam shows up to your website. She's like, hey, I'm Pam. And you're like, well, really? Like, how do I know that? The way we vet an individual is tied to either government-issued identity or what we call self-asserted, something basically saying like, that's Pam, is this idea of identity proofing. You often find it in regulated industries. So in banking, you have requirements to do know your customer and anti-money laundering. These require government documents to be presented in some fashion, proved to be accurate and valid, and then associated with the individual. So this is a proofing processes. Upfront proofing today tends to be more lengthy than secondary proofing. I'll give a talk on, let's call it Wednesday, and we'll talk about how account recovery involves, like how you get someone back to their stuff involves proofing as well. But here's the thing, in an employee setting, we all do this. You have a background check. You show documentation to get your job. And there's very regular standard things that you do. You show up with, a passport or a driver's license, things like this. So in a worker setting, we really know how to do this. But the thing is, in a B2B setting or B2C setting, this is really different. Like, how do I onboard a new business partner? It isn't just that, they say, hey, I'm Hutch from GE. Well, no, I need to make sure, how do we have proof that this is the organization we want to work with? And then how do we know that person is someone we want to work with in that organization? That's a very different kind of proofing process. Or all the way to a B2C setting where it's like, hey, I'm Ian. Okay, well, how do I know that? Well, how much do I care? One of the things that the trade-off in the proofing world, in the B2C world, is velocity versus veracity. There are organizations and apps where I need people in fast. Their user journey is get them in as fast as possible. They may have very low access, but I want that user registration. Velocity. There are others who say nope, either because of the brand experience, the business that we're in, what we want to deliver in terms of value, or the chance of fraud. I want to know that's really Ian Glazer. So I'm thinking about veracity. So there's different kinds of ways we can think about proofing in our onboarding and ongoing processes. You got all that? Signs of life, everyone okay? Okay, 8 minutes. Pam, you want to warm them up? Let's do this.
All right, we're ready. So in case it's not obvious, everything that Ian's been talking about is you're building a state machine. You are building a sense of corporate knowledge so that at any given time, you can understand what the state is of a user. Are they active in your organization? What are their roles? What are their entitlements? All of that data is passive data until the moment that the user decides they want to try to access a resource. So when you get to the runtime side, you're really talking about access management. And what is access management? Well, you have resources, right? You have many, many resources, whether you work at a vendor, whether you work at in an enterprise or a small business. You have the resources that are the lifeblood of your business. And it is imperative that only the correct people access those resources. So this is really important to remember. The success case for access management is not that people get in. I mean this. The success case is when certain people stay out. Okay, when you test every single application, do not only test the happy path, test the negative path. All right, there are times when people will misconfigure their application and they don't know for months because they only checked with the obvious cases. They essentially made sure they could log in, and that's a very bad thing. So if you are somebody who's working in access management, you're trying to leverage this massive state machine that you've spent all this time to create. What are you doing? Well, you're going to be setting up infrastructure for the most part. And ideally, that infrastructure should be static in that it's going to leverage your ever-changing volatile state machine. But you don't necessarily want to be in twiddling and moving around all of your different pieces. So you're going to try and set up essentially a framework on which you are going to leverage all of your state machine to deliver resources in a timely fashion to only the right people, right? And do that in as seamless as possible way with a good user experience. So that's what we're going to look at right now on the runtime. So we're going to talk only about 5 things, and the 5 things, this is a ridiculous amount of data to try and fit into how much time we have left. I will talk about authentication and factors, and then we're going to take 10 minutes. I will say, if you want to have a debate when you are out at coffee, the thing that I didn't ask Ian was, what is the difference between synchronization and provisioning? Just think about that for a while. All right, so it's just one of the many philosophical discussions to be had. So we're going to talk about authentication and factors first. There are debates all the time about what is authentication, right? The truth is, authentication is often defined very tightly in identity, but it has a very loose definition. Devices can authenticate. People can authenticate. Processes can authenticate. At the TLS transport level, your TLS session can mutually authenticate. Okay, so when you hear authentication, do not just think about that one thing that your users is doing at the end of the day. There's all sorts of other things that you need to be sure of as an access management engineer. You need to make sure that everything that's interacting with your system is supposed to be there. And authentication is the primary mechanism for doing that. So, and the other thing that you need to understand is just because something or someone is authenticated does not mean that you know who they are, like who they really are. Okay, so you can have, for example, one of the primary ways you can register for a website is something called tofu. Does everyone, who here has heard tofu? Okay, few. Tofu means trust on first use. Okay, you have a thing, an entity coming to your website, and they are going to give you self-asserted data, and then they're going to verify that self-asserted data every day or every week or every year for the rest of their relationship with you. That's literally all you know. You know that one day they gave you self-asserted data, right? And then you built a relationship with them based on that self-asserted data. But you don't know their social security number. You don't even know if they're a real person. They could be a bot. And from that uncertainty stems all sorts of crazy security insanity. And in fact, there is a session by Alex Weinert on account compromise called Dancing with Doppelgangers. So that's a good one for you to check out if you're interested in that. So authentication and factors. When we talk about authentication, we really started off way back in the day with string match. Type in a password, right? Check to see if this, you hash it, and you check to see if the hash matches the hash that you've, that you had stored when that whole tofu process started in the first place. But we have evolved as an industry. I can't possibly go through all of the factors that you can now choose to assemble as part of what is essentially a ceremony. So when you think of, especially with users, when you want to validate the presence of a user who's trying to access a resource, you are performing a dance. You are asking that user to perform for you, and you are negotiating with that user in some way. And in the old days, that was a very simple thing, and now it's become an art form. So you can use what are called active factors and passive factors. Active factors mean that you are actually setting up a hoop, and you want your user to jump through that hoop. So that can be entering a password, it can be plugging in a FIDO device, it can be plugging in a one-time password into a form. All of these things are active challenges. But what's happening in the industry right now is that there's a ton of passive stuff going on. So now people are watching, how do you type, right? How are you using the keyboard? What applications are you accessing once you log in? What network are you on, and is it the same network that you always access? So all of these factors are now combining into a much, much more sophisticated authentication practice. And if any of you are having trouble with return on investment, or you're selling things like single sign-on and fancy authentication to your, your superiors, you have to realize that this is the only reason why we are not all owned right now. Right? Literally, if you have applications that are still doing string match, you need to look at that. That is not an acceptable practice anymore. There are just too many ways to compromise a simple login form. All right, so 2 things you got to know about this. I've got 2 minutes, and then we'll break. Adaptive authentication. If you hear the term adaptive authentication, the whole point of adaptive authentication is to be able to make decisions based on how the authentication ceremony goes. So we're going to talk a little bit later, for example, about something called identifier first discovery. The whole idea about the adaptive authentication is, depending on how the user enters your organization, you may choose to give them a different experience. So if they come in on a managed device, for example, then you may not want to challenge them for any MFA at all, because you decided that they are a trusted device, and you may just send them on to their resource. But if they come in from a kiosk or an internet cafe in, say, Thailand, then all of a sudden you want a different deterministic path to execute for that user. And so adaptive authentication, works with multi-factor authentication and it will get more sophisticated over time to ensure that that by the time the user gets through all these hoops, you've given them the right set of hoops to mitigate the risks that you might perceive about where they are and how they're talking to you. So that's adaptive authentication. Multi-factor authentication, again, another argument you can have for the break. There is 2FA, there is MFA, there is strong authentication. If you ask 6 people in this room, they will all give you different definitions of what those things are. I personally subscribe to the idea that MFA should just be a lot of stuff. I don't think it should have fancier definition than that, right? Throw some hoops at them, see what they can jump through, declare success as quickly as possible. That's where we want to go with multi-factor authentication. However, okay, I'm super interested in this. How many people here use MFA every day? Oh, that's so nice to see. Okay, wait, now put those hands down now. How many people are still in password land only? So not very many. All right, that's excellent. Again, this is another topic that you're going to find a ton of sessions on. So you can go through the Identiverse schedule and search for FIDO, search for MFA, search for account compromise, search for phishing. All of those are going to give you more pointers into how MFA works. And which one? Oh, WebAuthn. WebAuthn, also very important. And we're going to actually talk about that as soon as we get back from the break. Here's the other thing about MFA, right? So now you are the access management engineer or architect. You're trying to set up this system so you can have an authentication ceremony. People can do the dance and do it securely. Well, how does MFA work? You've got the choice of 50 factors. What are you going to do about it? Well, the interesting thing about MFA is that MFA is not, in its breadth, standardized the way that a lot of the other technologies that I'm going to talk about after the break are. So if you want to have, if you want to install, 20 different MFA factors, a lot of that is going to be, at best, pluggable, meaning that we're back in connector land for MFA, right? And there are a lot of reasons for that. Part of it, I personally blame Radius. If you've ever seen Radius, right? Radius is the great compensation mechanism for a lot of authentication technologies because it's been around forever and you can sort of plug things in and it sort of works. It was originally designed to only take a password, but people have sort of jiggered it, I would say. All right, so on that note, we'll go for 10 minutes. Please, when you come back really quick so we can start right away, and we'll see you shortly.